Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. My name is Brian Griffith. This week we are talking about the situation within the Philippines. Recently, from April 6th to 9th, some different organizers held the National Summit for Human Rights and Democracy in the Philippines. That was various people. Over 380 people came to Washington, D.C. For that summit to unite to take action against the fascist Duterte government. And since then, there have been a lot of kind of coordinated actions across the country and, general awareness raising as well. To talk about all of this, the situation in the Philippines and the defense of human rights within the U.S., we are joined now by Mong Palatino. He is a former Filipino congressman as well as a human rights advocate who wears a lot of different hats, who does a lot of different, very interesting work. So thank you very much, Mong, for coming on the show.
Hello, Brian, and greetings to your listeners.
Yeah, it's very glad to have you. Can you talk a little bit first about kind of yourself, your own history as an activist and as a congressman, and kind of where, the kind of different organizations you work with and represent today?
Okay, so I became a student activist in 1997. We were opposing the proposal to change the Constitution of the Philippines because it will lead to the extension of terms of office of our elected politicians, a self-serving move. And then after that, we joined the People Power Uprising in 2001, which led to the successful ouster of the corrupt President Estrada. And then a few years after that, we helped in establishing the Kabataan or Youth Party List. And in 2009, I served in the Philippine House of Representatives for 2 terms, and this party list is still in Congress. So after 2013, I joined Bayan, or Bagong Alyansa Makabayan, in Metro Manila, an alliance of people's organizations in the Philippines. And since then, I've been active in urban poor issues, local development issues, environment protection, and other issues related to workers, the women, and urban poor sector in Metro Manila.
You were a large part of the National Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, and you're currently kind of on a speaking tour. I'm kind of catching you right now between 2 kind of legs of this tour. I know you were just in Dallas, and now you're headed to Houston. So can you maybe talk about the actions within the U.S. For kind of human rights and democracy in the Philippines?
So last month, we joined the National Summit organized by Malaya in Washington, D.C., and this assembly gathered 400 individuals and groups, which all united in expressing not just concern, but also commitment to resist the tyranny of the government of Rodrigo Duterte. So immediately after the summit, protests were also held in front of the Philippine consulate and even inside the Heart building of the Senate. And this also was followed by systematic and organized lobbying in D.C., where Filipino-American groups and friends discussed the human rights situation with various offices of United States legislators. So after the summit, the lobbying, the protests, we conducted several speaking activities across the U.S. So in the East Coast, we went to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and then we went to the Pacific Northwest, in the San Francisco Bay Area after that, the Midwest. And now we're in Texas for the last leg of the speaking tour. Although my colleague, Ed Cubelo of the Kilusang Mayo Uno, or May First Movement, is now in Hawaii for this leg of the tour.
I'd like to really get into what exactly it is that's happening within the Philippines. This is not a country that I think people hear nearly as much about as they should. Some people are kind of very familiar with the human rights violations of the Duterte government, but I think generally it's been off people's radar. Can you maybe give people kind of a rundown of what the Philippines has essentially become under Duterte, with regard to his drug war, so-called drug war, because it seems to just be a pretense for an assault on the urban poor, as well as kind of the other economic and social and environmental issues that have kind of plagued the Philippines under his rule.
So Duterte came to power in 2016, and he became globally notorious because of his war on drugs. And this war on drugs led to the killing of more than 20,000 drug suspects. But we're here in the U.S. to remind people that his human rights atrocities is not limited to the drug war. So here in the U.S., we mentioned about the war on drugs being really a war against the poor. But aside from that, we are telling people that the war on drugs is being used as a justification to launch a political crackdown against perceived enemies of the state. And aside from the drug war, Duterte is also accountable for imposing martial law in Mindanao, the second biggest island in the Philippines, for his all-out war against communists and suspected sympathizers of communists, the suppression of free speech, the trumped-up cases filed against activists and union leaders. So Duterte is doing all this to pacify not just the opposition, but also to suppress people's resistance. In Mindanao, the martial law was imposed to silence the indigenous peoples, to suppress the indigenous people's resistance to the entry of big mining corporations. And the suppression of free speech that we are reading about is related to his intention to silence groups and individuals who are criticizing the government and who are exposing the truth about the real situation in the Philippines.
Yeah, so that then the drug war also becomes, as you said, the pretense for all sorts of political crackdown. I'd love to give people a little bit of a contextualization for what it is that's been going on. So the U.S. has maintained an act, and especially with regard to the U.S. role, because based in the U.S., we can in many ways affect the kind of U.S. Foreign policy that leads to this the kind of crackdowns that you're talking about. So the U.S. has maintained a military presence since Filipino independence in 1946. Since 2018 alone, $184.5 million has been given to the Philippines for these various crackdowns, for essentially this kind of growing military and police dictatorship. The U.S. helped in many ways to inaugurate this drug war by giving initially $32 million to Filipino police for quote-unquote training and services. Later, an extra $26.5 million in July 2018 for police in support of what they called counterterrorism. And then, of course, $100 million in military aid to both the military and police in the Philippines through something called Operation Pacific Eagle, which is a quote-unquote overseas contingency operation that is exempt from congressional spending limits. So essentially, this is hundreds of millions of dollars going to the Philippines to enable this crackdown, when the Defense Department has lost track of 76 out of the 77 arms sales that have been conducted in the Philippines under this operation. So this is money that's going to essentially an oppressive regime. I think it's also interesting that Duterte has embarked on a program to what he says quote unquote modernize the Filipino military. This is something that kind of a euphemism we hear a lot when somebody begins to militarize a state of, oh yeah, we need to modernize the military. So there's been this kind of massive increase in military budget. Duterte has doubled the salaries of police, and in the course of this, there are also 5,000 U.S. troops deployed in the Philippines at any time, who have possibly been involved in the secretive missions. They've killed civilians. While they themselves, the U.S. troops, are exempt from essentially accountability in these cases. So the kind of the end goal, the real effect here, not end goal, but more the effect here has been that 450,000 civilians have been displaced by militarization within the Philippines, that 12 journalists were killed in the first 2 years of Duterte, 48 environmental campaigners were murdered in 2017, 14 massacres have been perpetrated over lands, either by the police or military or sometimes paramilitary forces by the year 2018. Labor leaders are being assassinated in broad daylight by either vigilantes or the police, and 134 human rights defenders have been killed under Duterte, as well as the 30,000 or so killed under the pretense of the so-called war on drugs that Duterte has kind of undertaken. Given the statistics here, given the fact that the U.S. is throwing so much money at this would absolutely, like the sort of human rights violations within the Philippines, both under Duterte and under kind of previous military dictatorships, absolutely implicates the Pentagon and the U.S. state in this kind of ongoing violence.
The information you shared are accurate, and I have to add that it's not just the money that you are giving to the Duterte government, which is really enabling human rights abuses, but also the support of the U.S. government for Duterte. When President Donald Trump visited the Philippines, he praised Duterte's war on drugs. And not just praising Duterte's war on drugs, he vowed to commit more military aid for the Philippines. And so during our lobbying in Congress and also our speaking activities here in the U.S., we reminded your legislators and the people here about the need to stop sending military aid to the Philippines, including the aid to the police for the narcotics program, because these are being used to enable or commit human rights abuses. Also, we should stop believing that the military aid is intended to modernize the Philippine military. A century of U.S. military basing in the Philippines didn't modernize our army because of corruption and also because of the inaccurate information that the bases were intended to help the Philippine military. So I also have to add that in recent years, more and more U.S. troops have been coming to the Philippines to participate in war games. And this is not only undermining our sovereignty, it's also leading to environmental pollution, the exploitation of our women, aside from heightening our vulnerability to external attacks. So yes, I think the U.S. government should be made accountable for its role in enabling leaders like Duterte in implementing their controversial and anti-people program.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM in Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Mong Palatino, a former Filipino congressman, as well as a human rights advocate about the situation under Duterte and the kind of role that the U.S. military and the U.S. government, Congress, has played in continuing to fund these kind of brutal crackdowns within the Philippines. I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the specific points at the kind of at the summit that was held again, April 6th through 9th. So there were 10 kind of points here. The first was the human rights crisis in the Philippines. The second was the impacts of Duterte's economic policies on Filipino migrants and workers. The summit also tackled press freedom, the rights of indigenous and Moro people under martial law in Mindanao, the Babe Ako movement in resisting Duterte's attacks on women. There are many others that were covered at the summit, but I'd like to maybe start with some of those, starting with kind of the situation of Filipino migrants and workers, if you're able to kind of talk some on that.
Okay, so we have a population of 100 million and 12 million of our people are working overseas. So here in the U.S., we have almost 4 million Filipinos across the U.S. And almost 6,000 people are living every day in the Philippines. And this is happening because of the political and economic conditions in our country. First, because of extreme poverty, because of lack of jobs, because of landlessness, people are forced to leave their communities, leave their families, and seek better opportunities to countries like the U.S. But aside from the economic conditions, we also have the political climate. Many people left the Philippines during the martial law years in the 1970s and 80s. And after that, the government, after realizing that labor migration is the convenient solution for unemployment, instead of creating jobs, instead of creating industries or developing our local economy, what it did was to implement a so-called labor export policy. And this really reorganized the bureaucracy, which made it easy for people to go abroad. We reoriented our school system to suit the manpower needs of other countries. We have various institutions, including the media, glorifying the life of migrants. And so you have here a situation where labor migration is presented as natural and even desirable, so that Filipinos, even young Filipinos, will think that the only way to fulfill their dreams, our dreams, is to go to another country. And so, because of labor migration, we lost a lot of skilled labor. And we're also documenting a lot of stories in cases where abuse of Filipino migrants, cheap labor, that they are being exploited in many countries. We have also cases, and I met several people here in the U.S. of trafficked individuals, especially women. And so I think one message that we are trying to deliver is that we have to review the labor export policy, and second, the need to protect the rights of migrants, both here in the Philippines.
In many ways, I kind of see a parallel between that situation within the Philippines with regard to the fact that this military and this kind of dictatorship that's been imposed then creates a kind of a crisis where people are kind of fleeing the country en masse, who then find their ways to the U.S. It almost sounds in some ways to be a very similar situation to, for instance, Central America, to Honduras. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear it. Other than that, I'd also like to maybe get into the kind of rights of indigenous and Moro people in Mindanao, which I believe, as you said, was the second largest island in Philippines. Rich in untapped mineral resources, and much as kind of we're seeing struggles over indigenous land rights within the U.S. trying to prevent the extraction of different oil and mineral resources on indigenous lands in the U.S. It seems to be a similar, obviously much intensified, but nonetheless a similar kind of struggle within the Philippines on Mindanao as well.
Okay, so you are correct in pointing out that we share similarities between our history and experience with several Central American and Latin American countries. Like them, the Philippines was a colony of the United States for half a century. And the U.S. government's colonial history is a lesson about the abuse, the violence inflicted on the local population. In fact, the waterboarding torture was first used in the Philippines in the 1890s, late 1890s. And in the 20th century, you have U.S. corporations, multinational corporations, which were able to exploit our natural resources, plunder our local resources, which gives them super profits, while communities were destroyed, and our people remain poor, and our nation remain underdeveloped. And then after World War II, you have economic policies imposed by U.S. banking institutions, which tied the country's economy to the needs of the U.S. and the financial institutions here. You have trade policies favoring developed countries like the U.S. You have financial conditions for our loans, which deprive us of funds for social services because the funds were used as for the payment of our loans to banking institutions. So the story of the Philippines is almost the same with the story of many Latin American countries. About your question with regard to the Moro and indigenous people, it is correct to point out that martial law is still imposed up to this day in Mindanao because the government wants to silence or pacify the people who are opposing the entry of the extractive industries like mining, logging, and palm oil plantations in the Philippines, especially in Mindanao. Our indigenous peoples are merely defending their ancestral domain and cultural heritage, yet they are being displaced. So martial law is not really about war on terror. It's about displacing our indigenous people, silencing them, and threatening their way of life.
And what then would be kind of the plan? Essentially, understanding that, for instance, the Philippine military and police forces essentially want to, in a sense, kind of colonize, conquer Mindanao. What then would that look like for the kind of environmental impact and the social impact that would have if they were to succeed in kind of destroying the resistance there?
Mindanao is rich in natural resources. Mindanao is rich in agricultural resources. And we fear that if the mining expansion will be allowed to continue, if logging concessions will be provided to several multinational corporations, and if palm oil plantations will be permitted in various regions in Mindanao, it will not only lead to environment degradation. It will not only destroy the lives of our indigenous people, but it will also, I think, intensify the local armed resistance. It will lead to the intensification of the political and economic crisis in Mindanao. And we don't want this to happen because historically, it is in Mindanao where intense clashes took place in the past between the Moro people and government soldiers, and now between government soldiers and communist rebels. So we are asking the government that the best way to address the conflict is to render poverty irrelevant. And poverty is related to the question of land, especially in Mindanao, where land grabbing deprives people of their livelihood and their cultural heritage. And we fear that if the martial law will continue, if the Duterte government will not be stopped, it could lead to severe political economic crisis, and the civil war might really escalate.
There are several kind of upcoming events around the Philippines or things that are going on within the U.S. So the elections in the Philippines are happening May 13th. There are kind of reports. I didn't read too deeply into this, but I'm sure you can talk about the kind of reports that the elections may be kind of less than above board, that they may in fact be kind of fraudulent or deceitful in some way. There's also June 12th, 2009, on Philippine Independence Day, there will be actions in local areas to demand the Duterte regime uphold Philippine sovereignty. And then July 22nd, this year, on the same day as Duterte's State of the Nation address, there will also be a People's State of the Nation address, national march and rally in Washington, D.C., and other major cities across the U.S. To expose the real conditions in the Philippines under Duterte. If you'd like to comment on any of those and anything else we have in our last couple minutes that you feel like we didn't get a chance to discuss.
Well, first of all, the elections on May 13 is really crucial because if Duterte secures a majority in the Senate, it can embolden him to fast-track his other priority legislation, which is to change the Constitution. We believe that a change of the Constitution will establish an authoritarian form of government in the Philippines. Duterte, being a lawyer, he wants legal justification for his dictatorship. And the election should give him the numbers in both houses of Congress. So, right now, we see the government using public resources to pay more candidates close to Duterte. And we expect them to use all their resources to really win in the national election. So if you have Filipino listeners or if you have friends who are Filipinos, it's very important to remind voters to vote for an independent Senate and to call out the use of government resources to favor certain candidates. About the protests you mentioned on June 12 and July, I think it's important to highlight this and also invite Americans and Filipino Americans and all those who love democracy and want to uphold human rights. And this is our concrete way of expressing support to the struggle of Filipinos for democracy and justice. And so we are thankful for this opportunity to share what's the real situation in the Philippines and to discuss concrete ways we can do to express support for our Filipino brothers and sisters.
Yeah, all of that is so important, and it's good that I've finally gotten a chance to really sit down and discuss the Philippines because with all the kind of mythology around the human rights around the U.S. being so quote unquote concerned about human rights in so much of the world, it's clear with the situation in the Philippines, with the fact that again the U.S. Has given something like $180 million in the last year alone to the Duterte government with all of its fascist leanings, that the U.S. in the Philippines and anywhere else doesn't give a damn about human rights, and that these people really need to be held to account when we're talking about that. So I think that's very important. We're going to have to wrap it up there. We were very glad to be joined by Mong Palatino. He's a former Filipino congressman and a human rights advocate who has been on a speaking tour across the U.S. about the situation in the Philippines with regard to the Duterte government and human rights. Thank you, Mong, very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brian, and greetings again to your listeners. Mabuhay.
You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7. We are also available as a podcast on, wherever podcasts are podded, and we broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM, New Orleans. Stay tuned. We are once again looking at an issue that we haven't covered as much as I'd like to. This is education. I found a very interesting article written in the Liberation News as a newspaper of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, profiling a teacher and teaching basically work conditions in Tallahassee, Florida, that I think is a representative, obviously, of a much larger trend with neoliberalism in teaching generally, but the kind of specifics, the kind of real the real meat of this article and this interview is what I want to delve deep into. So this is an interview between Shelby Shoup, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as Jake Asbell, who is a teacher, an avid teacher that's advancement via individual placement teacher at Godby High School. So we're bringing them both on the show to talk about the working conditions and unions for teachers in Tallahassee, Florida. Thank you both for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So yeah, let's get into kind of the big thing first, or one of the many big things, because again, with teaching, you have both the kind of deteriorating working conditions as well as the kind of deteriorating or stagnant wages. So I think it's very telling that Florida, as much money as there is in Florida, Florida still has one of the lowest teaching salaries in the country. Can you maybe talk about what that is kind of like? Just exactly how much teachers in Florida make and what sort of effect that has kind of on morale, and especially how is so much of this pay for teachers tied specifically to these kind of high stakes test scores that we've seen develop over the past few decades?
Sure. So teacher wages right now are sitting around, I believe the median level is about $42,000. I take home $39,000. I don't take that home. My salary is $39,000 a year, and I'm in year 8. So if that tells you anything, I also work 2 other jobs. I'm a candy chef on the side, so I work in the afternoons a lot of times, and then I'm also a soccer coach, so I'm typically working all weekend as well. And then as far as the standardized tests go, we have the FSA here, which is the Florida Standards Assessment, and all of our bonuses are based on that score plus our evaluation that we get from our administrators. So, and as far as morale goes, I would say it's pretty much at an all-time low, considering all the other states that we've seen who have had successful teacher movements, and the fact that we're still bottom of the barrel as far as pay goes in the United States, especially when you think about, again, as you said, how much money Florida has.
It's also kind of very telling because I kept kind of expecting more out of either as the teacher strikes have developed nationwide. I kept expecting the places that would be the next to kind of see these teacher strikes to either be Florida or Texas. Given having worked with teachers in Texas and knowing teachers in Florida, it really is rapidly deteriorating conditions. It seems to be very close to a kind of point of no return with regard to that starting salary of $41,000. For a lot of people, given that wages are so stagnant, that might sound like a lot, but the truth is, after taxes and healthcare costs, yearly salaries are still somewhere usually under $30,000. That's survival wage conditions, and that's often for work days that are kind of entire days. We're not talking about 8-hour work days. What does a typical work day look like for you?
Well, so I get up about 5:30 in the morning. I get to school usually around 7, and I usually have to have I do a guard duty basically. So I'll wander the hall, make sure nobody's in the hallway too early. As of right now, I'm the avid site coordinator for my school. So I have one less class period that I teach. So I've got 3 class periods in the morning that I teach. Those are all avid classes. And then I have 2 planning periods and lunch. In one of the planning periods, I typically go out and help other teachers. I either cover their classes for them, which I don't get paid extra for, or I'm facilitating what are called our avid strategies. So I'm trying to get other teachers on board to use similar strategies that I use in my avid classroom, because it helps kind of keep the kids all organized. And there are a lot of really fun and engaging activities. So, our philosophy is the more we can get students to do similar activities, the better they're going to understand that procedural knowledge. So, but there, from then, I've got a 6th period class. I teach English 1 honors, and I'm done there at 2 o'clock, and then I stay for another hour until about 3, which is when my contract ends. And then I'm typically off to work at Lofty Pursuits for a couple hours where I make candy. And then typically right after that, at least 2 days a week, in the afternoon, Monday and Wednesday, I have soccer practice from 7 at night until 8:30. So I typically don't get home till about 9:30 because there are two of my students that I take home because they don't have transportation. So long days on Mondays and Wednesdays for me.
So that's at least 2 days a week. That's a 5:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. job, which includes the entire day teaching, then a second job making candy, then a kind of third obligation there, teaching soccer that essentially where you also have to provide the transportation there for several students because that's something that's not kind of covered by the state.
You got it exactly right.
That's that's insane, but it's also, kind of sadly typical. Just given that so many teachers have been expected to take over, so many extra obligations of the school. I think that's one of the big ways that I think school administration has managed to kind of consolidate, essentially, squeeze more kind of labor power out of teachers without any kind of extra benefits. Is all of these extra obligations, often bus driving, school trips, or whatnot. Teaching different teams, leading different groups, while at the same time, also having to provide these lesson plans. There's not really time in the day for all of these things. Something has to give at some point or another, especially when you're taking over a second job that's outside of your field. Something at some point is really kind of having to give here. I'm wondering, when we're talking about morale at the schools, like how do teachers generally feel about this when they're asked to take over these extra things? Like, can you teach the soccer team or whatnot? It's often presented, I think, in a way of trying to suggest, well, don't you want to do this for the good of the kids? Don't you want to do this for, don't you want to do this, to really build like this school spirit and this spirit in the kids? How do teachers really kind of take that? Have you kind of seen a change? You said you've been teaching for 8 years. So have you really seen a kind of a change there in teachers' perceptions of that?
I haven't necessarily seen a change in it. I think it's exactly what you said. They know that we typically respond pretty emotionally to this job. I think if you're a real teacher, then these types of things that they ask us to do, you feel almost obligated to do them, even though you're not going to get paid extra for it a lot of times. And, I think behind closed doors, in the teacher's lounge, we'll complain about it, but then just as fast as I will complain about it, for instance, when the lady at the front office, who is a very nice lady, asked me to cover someone's class, it's really, really hard to say no. And they do this with us as far as our pay raises and things like that as well. They'll make us feel guilty for wanting a pay raise because they'll say, oh, that's more money out of our budget that we could use to spend on the kids or to spend on this or that. And so then we feel bad because now, they're basically telling us that we're taking money away from the kids. When a lot of that rhetoric is really not true. Leon County, for instance, ended last year with a $13 million surplus. And we went into negotiations this year with LCTA, the Teachers Association here, and they proposed a $3,000 raise for all the teachers. The school board came back with $1,000, so we finally compromised on $1,500. But then at the same time, they also approved to help build a brand new corporate charter school, one of which that is owned and backed by Florida politicians such as Richard Corcoran, who is our Secretary of Education in the state. And I've written op-eds on this as well. Unfortunately, we have a group of politicians in this state whose wives are deeply entrenched in either school boards, which most of them used to serve on, but currently now most of them are engaged in helping run these corporate charter schools while their husbands sit here in Tallahassee passing legislation that unfairly supports them. So while Leon County School Board felt like they should help spend money to build another charter school, all the teachers are here wondering, what about us?
Yeah, I think that it really is so connected. And I think one of the things that I think more teachers are seeing, and that I hope more will continue to see, is that the assault on schools, on public schooling in particular, has not been accidental, nor has it been piecemeal. So this, this push for kind of a quote unquote higher standards really dates back to the 1990s. That's when the kind of culture around how politicians treated schools really began to change. It's like sort of the late 80s and early 90s, which is when this charter school trend, from my understanding, really began. Like, charter schools started popping up in the late 1980s and as quote unquote the solution. At that point, though, there really wasn't that much of a problem. Public schools were at least better funded than they are today. So they had to essentially create this crisis. I think in many ways it was kind of a manufactured crisis of the past few decades, by imposing these stricter and stricter testing procedures. These continue to essentially become like sort of stricter, and they change every year. Is the other kind of thing, is that the kind of the baseline for what the tests are also changes every year. And so much of the teacher pay, because for so long teaching public education was kind of a highly unionized and also highly professionalized. Not to say that's still not. It very much is. Teachers do so much, and they have such a kind of level of specialized skill sets. But that came kind of under fire because the idea was to try and cut teacher salaries back, so that so that so many teachers would begin leaving the field. And so one of the ways that they did that, and I think the article that I read kind of in Liberation News goes through that very clearly, was that they started tying teacher pay to the test scores. And of course, these test scores, for anyone who's taken one of these, the test scores in many ways are completely arbitrary. To the degree they measure anything, they basically measure how much money there is coming into the school. How much income they're like, basically because schools are so heavily funded by property taxes and by the parents and whatnot. So it measures how much money is coming into these schools. And so but the other kind of major thing there is when teacher pay is tied to these test scores, that takes the place that, that is not a bonus at the end of the year. That has often taken the place of what should be kind of a yearly raise that accounts for, just inflation, that accounts for the rise in the cost of living that happens. So over the past few years, we've seen just like that's led to this kind of erosion that has essentially, because the schools in the richer school districts the richer schools have the money to be able to get the kids past these barriers of entry. They have not seen kind of the decline in quite the way the schools in these poorer school districts have, where teachers in the poor school districts, their wages go down because the test scores are not, up to par or whatnot. So then they lose funding. The school loses funding. And so then guess what happens next year? Because the school has less funding, the school does worse on the test, and the teachers that are now making less money have to either kind of stay in it because they're just that dedicated to teaching, or eventually, that's the rhetoric we keep hearing, is like the teachers have to stay in it because they love it, or eventually you get to a breaking point and you have to leave. And so I think now we've come closer to this breaking point where in so many school districts across every part of the country I know of, these the public schools are being told they're quote unquote failing because of this completely arbitrary testing system. And then the solution, of course, is to bring in these kind of fake nonprofit charter schools. Dr. Shoup has a very good book about this, Charter School Report Card, among many other kind of things that have been written about this, where these charter schools essentially are kind of these in many ways kind of tax scams. Many of them have been used for money laundering. They don't have any kind of proven benefits to really the students. They kind of for many years made up their own kind of data and basically they made up their own research. They paid for their own research, saying charter schools do this, but in fact, charter schools in kind of every objective test have proved to do either worse or at best kind of the same as public schools with the same kind of level of funding. all is really so connected in so many ways. That's where we kind of are at today in this point of struggle of like the charter schools are these quote unquote solutions, but in fact, charter schools just reinforce these systemic problems in so many ways. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic. We originate on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and we also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Jake Asbell, who's an avid teacher at Godby High School in Tallahassee. So yeah, maybe if you have any kind of thoughts on everything we just went over as regard to like the way I see that kind of a vicious cycle of privatization of schools or anything else that you feel kind of within that needs kind of commenting from your perspective as a teacher.
Well, I would say, I mean, if you look at New Orleans, which does not have a single public school within its city limits anymore, I think what the politicians are after here is defunding education to the point where they don't necessarily have to worry about that budget point anymore every year. And to me, what it looks like is a race war and class war when you think about the students who are being victimized by this overwhelmingly are poor minority students. Typically the ones that I serve at Godby High School. When you think of it that way, it makes me incredibly emotional, thinking about what could I do to stop this trend from continuing, to the point where I didn't really know much else to do but to write op-eds. I would love to get a teacher movement here in Florida started if possible. I think one of the issues, though, in the state is we do have a lot of apathy, a lot of teachers who are upset, don't really know what to do. And then we also have a provision in the state constitution that would potentially fire teachers if they went on strike, possibly lose their certificates, even their pensions as well. So when you start talking about stuff like that, as far as consequences go, you're going to get a lot of teachers who are going to be very hesitant about it. My idea about this, though, is one of the things that they're doing as well is they're trying to decertify our union. HB 7055 put a provision in place where if the unions did not have over 50% participation in the state, within their district, then they would be decertified, which now the teachers have lost all their bargaining power. Well, that provision was put in place in the Constitution for allowing teachers to form the union. So my legal question would then be, if we are not allowed to have unions because they decertify us, then what's stopping us from being able to legally strike?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. If it seems like unions are struggling to be to even kind of remain certified and retain that kind of institutional affiliation, then if the truth is, if unions do get cracked down on, that opens that door, that opens essentially the floodgate. Because first of all, the first thing we're going to see with unions, if the unions become decertified, I know that your district's fighting that. I know several other districts across, especially the Florida Panhandle, but I'm sure it's happening throughout the state of Florida. I can't imagine that any better in South Florida, but I know so many districts are fighting this right now to maintain this union certification. The question that some teachers have, either out of kind of apathy or out of just general exhaustion, is like, what has the union done? Well, we're about to see if those unions lose that collective bargaining power. We will see exactly what that union did. But at that point, it'll be kind of too late to save that particular those particular gains. People who work in unionized fields make 30% overall more than those who work in deunionized fields. So as low as teacher pay is, if teachers lose their unions in Florida or anywhere, that pay is going to go lower. But the thing is, that then creates that kind of, by exacerbating that problem, I think that intensifies what the solution is going to be. So if you lose the unions, there's only one real thing left to do. And if, unions no longer exist, as you said, if that union no longer exists in your district, there's nothing legally to prevent everyone from going on strike, because that kind of collective agreement with the union is no longer really in place. I wonder what you kind of see as the kind of perspective, the possibilities of that there. Like what sort of are the possibilities for kind of fight back beyond kind of, again, waiting for this, waiting for some kind of legislation? Like what is this possibility for direct action looking like right now?
I mean, if I might hop in, I think it's kind of it's kind of interesting, right, to see. So I still need to confirm this, but I recently saw a teacher from Leon County and say, it was just on Facebook, that as far as they knew, Leon County School, or LCTA, was the only union left in Florida that still hadn't met the 50% mark, and they only needed like 40-something teachers to get there. But it's interesting that, and I think that definitely as a product of being in the capital city, we're about to end the legislative session on May 3rd, and that's been going on for like the last 2 months. And the teachers union, along with a lot of progressive groups, for the last 2 months, have been taking a very legislative approach, not a very militant or direct action approach, but a very, we're going to fill the floor, we're going to tell those legislators we're watching them, and then, they vote the same way they were going to vote whether or not we were there. But I think that proximity, being the capital city, is kind of like a shackle in a way, because a lot of times I think that the legislative approach is kind of valorized, or maybe just like hyper normalized. But then it's funny, right, to see West Virginia as sort of this like beacon of hope, where the teachers who went on strike in West Virginia, it was also illegal for them, because it's illegal in 3/5 of the states, in most states, for teachers to go on strike. And they won, their pay raises and their health benefits the first time around. And then very recently, West Virginia teachers threatened to go on strike again in response to a bill, a piece of legislation, and the GOP majority legislature voted. They killed the bill. They killed the bill because the West Virginia teachers threatened to go on strike, and their threat of strike only lasted a couple hours. So it's like, even if you do want to take the legislative approach, you still need that striking power, that collective bargaining power, because if you're just going there and you're like watching them, there's no actual power in that. You have to be able to bring something from the table to the table, so that way you can like take it away from the table. Because that's where that's at.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that really adds a lot. And, of course, like this idea of whether it's a quote unquote legal or illegal to go on strike is really, it really depends on kind of, I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, there's a legality or an illegality to it, but all of that at some point just becomes completely arbitrary when you push people to their limit. When you push people,
and I mean, honestly, like, they don't have, if teachers were to go on strike, they don't have the stab power to fight that, right? Like at the beginning of this school year, there were 4,000 open positions, teaching positions in the state of Florida, and at the end of this school year, there's a projected 10,000 open positions, right?
Wow.
We have this huge teacher shortage crisis in the state of Florida right now. So it's like, if all these teachers went on strike, they can't even fill the positions they already have open. Where are they going to get the scab power to, fill in the blanks if teachers went on strike? Like, it's impossible, and like Jake and I talked about this a lot at work. Like, if teachers were on strike, like, you can't say no to everybody. They don't have the substitutes. They don't have the replacement teachers. If Florida teachers were to go on strike, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, oh, you'll lose your job when they're so desperate even to get someone to fill the jobs. I think again, it depends. I've talked about this a lot on the show, but really, it's like understanding which kind of methods lead to the kind of effects that we want. When we're talking about the working conditions and pay conditions for teachers, most people in the country, even in like more conservative places in Florida or whatnot, most people in the country support, by and large, teachers, and they want to see teachers make more money, and they want to see teachers, have better working conditions, and they want to see teachers be able to thrive because teachers provide such a valuable public service, and because teachers are people. How about that? And so then the question becomes, how is the best way to get this? And so for 30 years, even more in some places, for 30 years, we've seen this constant crackdown of teacher rights. It's coming through this legislative session, or coming through this essentially the legislation cracks down on teachers. And for a long time, so many teachers didn't see it as like an intentional thing. I've known a lot of teachers growing up, and teachers would always, kind of say things like, oh, these stupid legislators, these just kind of like stupid legislators and whatnot. They don't understand what they're doing. They're doing all the wrong things. And as we've seen kind of the reemergence of, I guess I would call it just an open evil in the world, as we've seen like these sort of all of the cracks in society that have always existed come more to the surface, it's very obvious that the legislators entirely mean it, that someone like Betsy DeVos, she's not stupid. To use one example, Betsy DeVos, I mean, she might not personally be very I don't want to speak to her cognitive ability, but she's not stupid when she's when she's saying, when she's attacking public schools. She's doing it very deliberately. Whether she believes what she says or not, whether she's lying or telling the truth about any given issue is kind of irrelevant, because it's an attack on schools because she stands to profit from it, because she, her brother being Eric Prince, who's, runs the Blackwater mercenary company. These are people who profit from this kind of social ill that they've created. Yeah, so we have a couple minutes left. Once again, we're talking with Shelby Shoup and Jake Asbell. Jake is a teacher at Godby High School in Tallahassee. Shelby Shoup is a political organizer and a reporter for Liberation News. We've been talking about kind of teacher strikes. Teacher strikes, but specifically kind of teacher conditions within Florida. Any sort of kind of last thoughts as we begin to wrap up here on kind of the state of education in Florida, on the state of unions, or otherwise just where do we go from here?
I would like to just point out, I want to go back to something you had said earlier about how everyone can agree that we should pay teachers more, that we should give them better benefits, that we shouldn't have them working long hours, or at least not require them to work extra jobs just to survive, or to buy a house, or to just, live the American dream. And I think where we lose that argument, or we lose the power behind that argument, is that the people who could affect change are the parents, because they're the ones who have a real stake in this. It's their kids that are at the school, but so often, and I in fact heard this exact conversation over the weekend while I was talking to a group of my soccer parents, and they all pretty much say the same thing. I only have to wait a few more years. I only have this many years, and then my kids are out of school, and then I don't have to worry about it. And if that is the attitude of the average American, then we can understand why in a state like Florida, where we have so many retirees who do not have children in public school, they see a disconnect between the property taxes they pay and the schools that they fund. My only argument then would be, of course, is that isn't education society's job to fund fully and to provide for our children? I mean, otherwise we end up with cracks in society as we're looking at today.
Absolutely, Jake. And I think that really speaks to what you're saying is the mainstream, or maybe the dominating perspective on education, is that it's a commodity, and therefore it's only as good as it's useful to you or your child. Well, really, education is a right, and it's our responsibility, to do that. And for me, being an education student in college, with the possibility of not having a union, maybe by the time that I'm a teacher in Florida, that's scary, because I can't fulfill that responsibility to educate, to be the best educator that I possibly can be, if I can't make enough money to survive, because teacher working conditions directly translate into student learning conditions. So if you want to support students, you have to support teachers. And that's just kind of like the zero-sum game of it,
Yeah, you're both absolutely right. And this was a real sort of interesting conversation to have. I hope to talk about this again sometime in the near future. This is something that, continues to unfold, that gets so little coverage on the mainstream or the corporate media, whatever you want to consider that. So we've been talking with Shelby Shoup, as well as Jake Asbell joining us from Tallahassee, Florida, about the kind of state of education there, the state of unions there, and understanding kind of the especially the possibility of there being at some point in kind of the near future, as these teacher strikes spread across the nation, the possibility that there may be a teacher strike at some point. So yes, thank you very much again, Shelby Shoup and Jake Asbell, for joining the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.